Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the Society for Implementation Science and Nutrition. My name is Dr. Eva Monterrosa, and I work at GAIN, and I'm a very proud founding member of SISN. And it's a pleasure to be the moderator for today's broadcast, where Bill O'Keefe has kindly agreed to share with us his experiences. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. You may send your questions at any time during the presentation. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and I will pose as many of your questions as possible to Bill as the time allows. If you experience any technical issues, please also type your questions in the question box, and our staff will help you address these. We're also active on Twitter and encourage you to chat and engage with us through our Twitter hashtag, which will appear in the chat box, #InvestInIR. And finally, a recording of the webinar will be made available after the session. So I met Bill last summer at a foundation event where we were sharing about implementation research experiences. Bill gave a talk on advocacy and it's important to IS and IR. And I found his talk quite insightful and thought that our SISN members may also enjoy learning about how these two worlds, the advocacy world and the implementation science world, are linked. And Bill is truly the right person to tell that story today. Bill is Catholic Relief Services, and I'll use the acronym CRS. He's their interim executive vice president for church engagement and vice president for government relations and advocacy. And he's based at their headquarters in Baltimore in the US. He oversees efforts to change the US foreign policy in ways that promote justice and reduce poverty overseas. This involves lobbying Congress and the administration on a range of foreign policy issues and educating US Catholics about international issues involving them in public campaigns for policy change. In his current role, he is also a board member of the US Global Leadership Campaign. Bill received his Bachelor of Science cum laude from Yale University in 1984 and a Master's in Public Policy from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard in 1987. He joined CRS that year as a project manager in Tanzania, designing and monitoring community development projects. He has served in various capacities for CRS and was appointed to his current role back in 2003. So with great pleasure, I introduce Bill O'Keefe. And Bill, over to you.
Good morning, everyone, or good morning here, good afternoon, and good evening wherever you are. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be with you, and I think this is a very timely topic for us all as we figure out how to close the gap between the global targets around nutrition and health, and then the achievements that we are reaching every day. And so advocacy is a key part of that, and getting to scale and making the kind of difference that I know all want to make in the world. So what I'd like to do for starters, I'd like to kind of connect the 5 domains that the society has put together as its framework with advocacy. So first, in terms of the objects of implementation, there's a couple of ways that advocacy supports those objects. First is just getting funding, particularly from governments and multilateral institutions, for nutrition-specific and nutrition-sensitive interventions, for emergency nutrition responses. And so the funding is a key part of how advocacy supports those objects of implementation. We also, in the advocacy world, work on the structure of the programs that through which that money comes. So, for example, in the last Congress in the United States, we worked on the Farm Bill, which supports nutrition-sensitive interventions supported by the U.S. government's Title II program. And we also worked on the orphan and vulnerable children's component of the American PEP PEPFAR HIV response, which ties to nutrition-sensitive interventions, and the Global Food Security Act, which supports nutrition-sensitive interventions. So the first thing is we have the funding. The second is the kind of authorization of programs. And the third is national policies. Advocacy, and I'll talk about this a little later, is a critical way of addressing the policies of countries, developing world countries, where nutrition interventions are being implemented. Then the second domain of implementing organizations and staff in ministries, NGOs, private sector, I mean, that's all of us together. And we work very closely, certainly in Washington, in New York, again, with the UN. We work together in coalitions of private sector and NGOs and governmental groups, all trying to improve the nutrition sector. And so many of the implementing organizations and staff actually work together to make policy change. Third, the enabling environment. This is obviously a huge topic, but one of the areas that may not appear to be related to nutrition that the advocacy community is very much concerned with is the closing civil society space brought about by anti-terrorism regulations and by the engagement of the militarization and securitization of aid and other factors. And so the impact of advocacy on the enabling environment is something that we take very seriously and work very, very hard at. Fourth, individuals, households, and communities, obviously, and I'll get to this, benefit from and hopefully benefit from the advocacy that we're doing, and in the end are the focus of why we're all advocating. And then finally, implementation processes. We work very hard on learning lessons about how funding, what are the funding mechanisms, grants, contracts, and how to make those mechanisms work better for implementers, how to make them more flexible, longer term, more tailored to local environments. And so advocacy is a really important way of taking the lessons of implementation and then changing the system that supports that implementation. So we're really, I think there are very close connections between advocacy and the 5 domains. I want to talk about CRS for a second and just give you our advocacy framework. And I think other organizations have similar frameworks, but I just want to lay it out here. CRS has something called the Integral Human Development Framework. And all that basically means is it takes Catholic social teaching, boils it down into a model for human development where individuals and households have assets. They have spiritual, human, social, political, financial, natural, and physical assets. And the goal of our work is to help them to increase their assets. But that all happens in the context of systems and structures, economic, political, private systems and structures. And so the more assets people have, the more they can influence the systems and structures in which they find themselves. And the more they can influence the systems and structures, the more that communities can thrive and build up their own range of assets. That strategy both is part of our overseas programming and what we're trying to advance, but also everything we do in the United States. Everything we do in the United States is directed at looking at those systems and structures and figuring out how can we improve those systems and structures so that there are better outcomes in the field. So in order to do that, changing policy, and for us as an American organization, particularly U.S. government policy, is a really important a mechanism. And so this is the policy cycle, and I'm going to just quickly give you a sense of how this works in terms of thinking about changing policy. Starting on the left-hand side with agenda setting, it's helping to make sure that people understand nutrition, for example, is an issue that's important out there. And then Policy formulation means figuring out what are the particular recommendations that the government could implement that would improve this important issue of nutrition. Decision making are the various mechanisms that take a policy that's been formulated, a set of recommendations, and then make it happen. And then implementation, of course, is where once you have agreed on policies, it's implementing and then monitoring and evaluation. The critical point for you all, I think, as implementation researchers and scientists is you have a key role in the monitoring and evaluation that feeds into setting the agenda and developing policy formulation. At CRS, for example, our recommendations come from our folks on the ground. And to the extent that we can build those relationships, we have a credible and helpful set of recommendations. Now, the problem is that's all a very nice circle, but it turns out there are lots of different actors, and influencing them is a complicated process in a complicated system. I'm not going to go into detail about that, except so that you see it's not quite as simple as that first circle. We have to attend to various elements within the government. We have to attend to the private sector. We have to attend to donors. We have to attend to civil society, all who have a voice in the various pieces of that policy process. Just to step back for CRS, whatever impact and influence we have in advocacy really comes from three things. The first is our ability to leverage our field experience, expertise, and evidence. And this is where I think you all are so absolutely important. We can't just be a think tank, and we have to be able to communicate in a clear and compelling way the experience that our folks on the ground have had and why we are making the recommendations that we're making based on that experience. That is in the most important thing, their expertise, their evidence, their experience. The second is, down in the lower left-hand corner, the extent to which we can engage our constituents in the United States as citizens in the political process. And here, all politics is local, as they say. And so in this case, what that means is we need people in Des Moines, Iowa, to be contacting their representative, their senator, or the president of the United States and saying, hey, I know there's a lot of evidence and expertise behind this, but I care because how I view the role of the United States in the world, and myself as someone who cares about other people, these issues are important. And so the political weight that comes from that is a critical part of advocacy. And then finally, for us, having a framework, a moral framework of church teaching and relationships that we can communicate from. And I think all of us, whether we're part of a faith-based organization or not, can speak from a human rights framework or something that's bigger than ourselves that connects with policymakers and where they can say, yeah, that's the right thing to do. So our model of policy change in the United States, we bring a kind of a holistic approach, and I just want to cover a couple of the elements of this. First, the left orange side are really the kind of government relations side, the stuff we do in Washington principally, and on the right, the more ochre, I guess is the color, are the things we do outside of Washington in order to build political support. So to give you a sense, we have a little office in Washington, and I'm sitting in it right now actually, and I have a couple of colleagues. Your organizations have a similar operation, and their job is to build relationships with the key members and key staff on Congress on Capitol Hill. And their job is also to build relationships with the executive branch, the administration, and communicate to them our lessons and our recommendations. We also have an absolutely critical role going counterclockwise for our overseas partner and staff. As I said, our expertise and experience is the primary source of our credibility. So, and our nutrition staff come from overseas. We take them to Washington. We hold little mini lobby days. We help them to make their case so that to deepen the knowledge base of key congressional leaders who are making decisions around these issues. We work in coalitions, as I said before. In the nutrition space, the 1,000-Day Coalition is really important. We're a part of a coalition effort that has been supported by the Eleanor Cook Foundation, which is a super wonderful foundation that's really taken a lead role in supporting advocacy on issues of nutrition. And we at CRS are deeply appreciative of their support for our work in nutrition and food security. In the broader movement building or kind of outside of Washington area, we work a lot through media and social media. Social media is increasingly important in Washington in tweeting at or to or around legislators and their staff so they can see that there is interest and support for particular policy changes. We work with grass tops. Let me explain grass in this context. It's not your usual. There are three kinds of grass in advocacy. There's grassroots, and that basically means regular people. There's grass tops, and that basically means people who have particular access or influence with policymakers. And then there's astroturf, which is fake grass. We don't do astroturf. Astroturf means basically people who are paid to pretend that they're real constituents in one way or another. That's not our vibe, so you won't see astroturf here. But we have a legislative network, a grassroots network of 70,000 or so individuals who we invite to write to their congressperson. I'll talk about that in a little bit. We have go-to advocates who are people who we call from that grassroots network and invite to take greater action. And then we have grass tops folks who are, for us, our bishops, board members, major donors, people who can and have picked up the phone and called a senator and said, I think it's really important that we do more here. So we're trying to bring all those things together in a holistic way at the same time to make a difference. Now, I'll just quickly go over some research that we've benefited from and conducted about the most effective way to influence lawmakers. And basically, I'm essentially a lobbyist, and I use that in the most positive sense, hopefully. But my job is, everyone knows here in Washington, I'm paid by an organization to communicate a message. But people who are not paid by the organization to communicate a message are in some ways the most influential people. So in person, the most impactful thing is an in-person visit by a constituent of a lawmaker. And the rule basically is the more work it takes to communicate, or the more effort to communicate a message, the more impact. And so when somebody takes the time, a real live person, to come from Des Moines to Washington and communicate a message about nutrition, that makes a huge difference. Relationships are critical. So Congress places a very high value on groups and citizens who take the time to build an ongoing relationship. Kind of episodic or ad hoc contacts can be helpful, but really don't replace the long-term relationships. That's why we have an office in DC. That's why we try to bring a constant stream of advocates from the field, or specialists from the field, and then people from our constituents around the country to meet with legislators so that they experience a constant, consistent relationship on issues that are important to us. And again, the more personal the information that we communicate, the better. So, for example, we always advise our folks coming from the field, let's say if we have an American citizen who's an expert in nutrition in Malawi, when they come, we try to set up a meeting with the congressional representative for where they're from and encourage them to make the connection about why they as a citizen care about this, and then what they as a professional have learned and wish to communicate about this. And bringing together that personal and local perspective, what connects back to the congressperson is extremely effective. I have just some pictures here, which I'll show you. We've done faith leaders as advocates have been extremely effective, particularly at this point in time in the United States. And we've worked very hard, again, with support of the Eleanor Crook Foundation to build a network of faith leaders, both who we bring from overseas here and who we rely on from the community in the United States. These are just pictures of some of our grasstops leaders, bishops meeting with senators, and they have a capacity of getting meetings that are hard for the rest of us sometimes. And so now, again, consistent action and quality actions make the difference. So the more personalized the message, use of social media, appearing at town halls, all these are important tactics that we use every day and try to position our constituents and our experts from around the field. I do want to give you a little bit of information about to try to demonstrate that all this indeed does work. The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which I know many of you will be familiar with, was reauthorized in the last year, and there was an effort to reauthorize it without the orphans and vulnerable children component. And we and other groups engaged our grasstops constituents as well as our direct lobbying efforts, and were successfully able to reinstate that critical nutrition-sensitive programming for children in the bill that eventually was passed and signed into law. The Farm Bill, is a huge piece of legislation that, for the non-Americans on the phone call, authorizes all the domestic and international agricultural support by the U.S. government, and the international side that supports a significant amount of nutrition-sensitive programming is it could easily fall through the cracks. And so, in a bill that size, we worked extremely hard as part of a number of coalitions and alone to make significant reforms to the food assistance programs to make them more effective and more efficient. And we're very proud of that. It took a lot of work by our by experts from the field, by a team of people in Washington, and by constituents around the country. We also, I think, as a community, can be extremely proud of preventing draconian cuts to the international assistance budget, including nutrition-specific and nutrition-sensitive funding. The administration for the last couple of years has proposed overall 30% cuts in foreign assistance, including to key nutrition accounts, and the community has really rallied and made its case about the importance from a moral perspective and from an economic perspective and a national security perspective. And I think we should all be extremely proud of how we have been able to hold the line, and in some cases even to increase funding for key nutrition specific and sensitive efforts that benefit the people we all care about. Okay, I just want to touch on one other quick topic, which is that advocacy isn't just, at CRS at least, isn't just about what we do in the United States. So the way we should be at CRS looking at things is we have overseas projects and programs and partners that are I'm not sure I'll get your terminology right, but are engaged in objects of implementation for nutrition. Those folks on the ground should be looking at the systems and structures that those programs operate in, though, and identifying, so what are the policy changes locally in the country where we're operating, and how should what are those policy changes that are needed, and how should we be helping our partners on the ground to advocate in their own countries to improve the local policy framework. And then, of course, they should also be working with me and my team to look at U.S. policy, and I've certainly already discussed that. And finally, at the global level, when at the United Nations and in the range of global forums where nutrition is discussed, what are the lessons that we have to offer in those critical forums? So let me just mention a little bit about the local national advocacy, which is kind of the oval second from the bottom there. For example, in Rwanda, CRS helped to write the National Social and Behavioral Change Communication Strategy for Integrated Early Childhood Development, Nutrition, and WASH. So there, we had a conscious effort to take the lessons, programmatic lessons, that our experts had developed, and then work with the government to change the National Social and Behavioral Change Communication Strategy in order to bring those experiences to scale. I'm sure many of you are doing this in the countries where you're operating, but I think it's critical to know that that's part of it. That's a critical part of advocacy. And in Madagascar, CRS has a USAID Food for Peace Development Food Security Project, and we developed a model called Community-Led Total Nutrition that had a lot of success, and the government of Madagascar is considering embedding it as a national policy for community mobilization. Again, taking the lessons of implementation and implementation research and then trying to work with the government to embed those lessons into national practice. That's critical. We all want to scale up our initiatives, and getting the governments to adopt successful programs and successful models is really important for that. With that, why don't I open it up for questions? I'm going to just show you. I hope you've seen how advocacy fits into the 5 domains of your work. How CRS as an organization, as an example of an advocacy presence in the United States, brings together its implementation and research in order to influence policy through a sort of an integrated advocacy strategy, how constituents can get involved most effectively, and finally, how on the ground in the countries where we operate, there's critical advocacy at the local national policy level, which has major impacts on the work that you all are doing. With that, I'll turn it back over to our facilitators, and look forward to answering any questions that folks might have.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill, for this insightful presentation. And I'm just going to give a few minutes for folks to type in their questions in the question box, please, rather than the chat. The chat's a little busy with other messages. So if you have questions for Bill, please use the question box. And Bill, I have a few questions as we wait for the audience members to set in their questions. You mentioned that you work a lot in coalitions. Can you speak a little bit about how is it that you work together with other organizations that either might not be related to, may also have different priorities, but the fact that you're working as a coalition with other NGOs, I wonder if you can speak a little bit about that, how that happens.
Sure. So it's such a interesting thing here, and I'm sure in every country there's a coalition for every issue and sub-issue, different groups that are kind of coming together based on shared interests. And in the nutrition space, there's the formal 1,000 Days Coalition, which is, kind of convenes action and advocacy. But then on the various kind of subtopics, for example, the Farm Bill, Title II work, the PEPFAR, Orphans, Vulnerable Children work, there's lots of other coalitions. Maternal Child Health has a coalition. And some of those coalitions have their own staff that play an important convening role, and others, are more kind of spontaneously generated by the organizations that participate in them. But they're really, really important for communicating that the community is on the same page, more or less. And I have many times been in a meeting with a member of Congress or a key staff person who said, I agree with what you're saying, but are other organizations, do they also agree? And they do that because they don't want to go in a certain direction and then bump up against resistance from another direction that they weren't aware of. So the more that we can work together, the more comfortable they're going to be taking a political risk when we ask them and encourage them to do so. The things that we do together, just to give you a sense kind of the tactics, we will have sign-on letters that, for example, express to the key members of Congress support for a certain level of nutrition funding. And all the groups that are interested in that will sign on to a joint letter that serves as the vehicle of communicating this community support. We'll do either collections of groups, or the coalition will organize briefings for congressional staff where we might bring in people from the field who can talk about in greater depth and in a kind of question and answer format, how exactly do these programs work? What exactly happens on the ground, and why, therefore, are they so important? We do a lot of, we'll also set up meetings jointly and just go office by office in different configurations of groups and meet so that we're kind of presenting a unified front. So there's lots of things that we do together, and I think in these various nutrition-related issues, there's a very robust coalition work.
Yeah, yes, and I think that whole what you mentioned about coming together and showing exactly how do the programs work and what happens on the ground. Again, it's a nice link to what we do as implementers and how we use implementation research to really show the governments that we are making judicious use of their funds and that we're implementing evidence-based actions. Yeah, thank you for that. There's a question actually similar that draws on something you mentioned about different tactics. And this question is coming from Ruchi, who asks, can advocacy be documented in a scientific manner? Or is it that we just start with a well-documented plan and strategies, as you've outlined, rather than making it more opportunistic? So I think there's two questions here. One is, can advocacy be documented in a scientific manner? And the second one is, should we be more strategic rather than opportunistic?
Okay, so those are two great questions. I'm going to answer the second one first. So I think that there is a proactive and a reactive component. So on the reactive side, we know in the last Congress, we knew that the Farm Bill was coming up. And so we're reacting to the policy opportunity that is presenting itself. We know it's coming. We developed a set of positions on it. We, based on our implementation research and the voices from the field about what could be changed that would improve the programs. And So, and on the funding, for example, we agree on numbers that we're trying to advance, and then react to the president's budget proposal and blah blah blah. So there's definitely a reactive part of it, and I think and reactive in this context is not bad. It's just the way it is, because these processes at some level are bigger than us. Then on the proactive side, you might remember I'm going to just go back to a slide here. The agenda setting. So that's really, I think, where the proactive piece of this is. It's sort of saying, okay, how do we get the conversation in Washington, for example, around the right issues? What if we really wanted to get to accomplish the SDG? What would we really need to do differently? And then how do we build the vehicle and get support for the vehicle and get it passed that would advance that? So let me give you an example that we're thinking about right now. So early childhood development and the experience that we and others have learned about, kind of how do you get from age 2 to age 5 when a kid is in school, or roughly, how do you prepare kids for success in those critical years beyond, and obviously nutrition is a component, but not only. There are some gaps in U.S. policy and U.S. priority in those areas that we figured out. So we're grappling with how could we advance legislatively and put pressure on the government, therefore, to fill that gap, to have a strategy that would be helpful in that way. So that is a much more kind of proactive effort to fix a problem that we've identified out of our work. So that's the second question, and from my perspective, the first question I've already forgotten. Would you mind repeating?
Yes.
Sorry.
So can advocacy be documented in a scientific manner?
Oh yeah. So there's so much robust discussion about monitoring and evaluation of advocacy, and there are the Gates Foundation, for example, has hired consultants who have met with a number of us over the last couple of years, trying to figure out, so how do you demonstrate impact? And the current the current understanding is it's more or less impossible to attribute particular policy changes to particular advocacy actions, at least because the system of policy change is so complicated. Remember my many arrowed diagram here. So our intervention, there is no way for us to prove definitively that a bill that Congress passes was because of our action. So the best practice right now, it's interesting, this is a topic that myself and the people in my position at some major NGOs are going to be talking about next week. But the best practice right now is to say the policy process is well known. And so if you can show, as we can at least, where we intervened along that well-known policy process, how many people did we involve at the right time, communicating the right message to the right people? Did that legislator hold a hearing? Who's on the committee? Were we involved in setting the terms of that hearing? What sign-on letters were we a part of? Kind of, et cetera. Can we show and make a reasonable case, given the known policy change process, that we were a major contributor to that? So no one has been able to figure out how to show attribution, but the best practice is to be able to tell a story with data that makes the case for why your actions contributed in a significant way to the outcome. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that is. So technically we can't really show attribution, but we can show contribution, and that's sort of the bottom line there. That's good.
That's
Thanks,
the
Bill.
bottom line. Yeah, that's the bottom line at the impact level. I mean, certainly,
Yeah.
If a congressperson makes a statement on the floor of the Congress in support of a piece of legislation and references Catholic Relief Services, I can attribute that to him,
Right.
or her. But that doesn't mean doesn't mean the bill's going to pass. So, so that you can attribute micro actions, but not macro results.
Great. So I have another question from Lidan. And her question is about the advocacy work with legislators, specifically in the US. Lawmaking takes time, and the results on nutritional status also take time to show. Yet legislators are on election cycles. So how do we present nutrition issues in a way that appeal to legislators? And is there a particular argument that you found effective to entice their interest to take action?
Okay, that is a fantastic question, and a couple things. First of all, I'm going to give you an example of that I to make my first point. I had breakfast yesterday with a Republican senator, and because it was off the record breakfast, I'm not going to tell you who, but this senator had a sibling who had an NGO, supported an NGO that had work in South Sudan. And the knowledge of that is really important for how I'm going to make the case to that senator about why U.S. assistance in South Sudan is important. So lesson number one is you need to know your audience and then figure out what the connections are person by person. And is this a person who's motivated by faith and therefore concern, or does this person have children? Has this person demonstrated real concern and interest of children? Has this person adopted children? Has this person, what is the history of the legislator that might give you some clues about what would appeal to her or him in a very particular and personal way? The second thing is, my point about all politics is local. So is there a connection between the district or the state where the legislator is located and nutrition? So, for example, we are based in Maryland, and we get huge support from the Maryland legislators because Catholic Relief Services employs several hundred people in Baltimore and is a major face to the community. And so we make sure that our Maryland legislators know what we're doing, and we push them to support, and it's in their interest to support. So we work the local angle as well, and that's some of the constituent things I talked about earlier are a key part about that. The other thing is, looking for ways to make the argument and this is where you all can be so incredibly helpful, between the work you're doing, the development of countries, and the stability and U.S. interests in those countries. Because while it is true that legislators are elected on 2-year cycles, at least in the House, and 6 in the Senate, most of them actually, particularly in these sorts of issues, they're not getting elected or not elected on the basis of their stance on nutrition globally. It's not so much of an issue that their constituents are going to say, I'm going to vote against you because of your stance on it, or I'm going to vote for you. Therefore, that's actually a gift, because it means it's possible to get people to actually do the right thing. It is possible to make an argument in the interest of the United States, in the interest of our economic development, and in the interest of our country as just moral, responsible global citizens. It is possible to make those arguments and have them carry the day. It is much more difficult to make those arguments convincingly and effectively on issues that people are winning and losing elections on, because there's money behind it, and they feel much more boxed in politically. So that's a great question, though, and I think the gift of your all's work is one to demonstrate that the impact that because what we hear is from a lot of legislators as well as citizens, yeah, I support this. This is all good. Of course, we should do this, but I don't believe that it works. Or in the end, it's just money down a rat hole. And so your ability to communicate, no. This money has reduced malnutrition by X, and that has is going to result or is resulting in increased economic activity, and that is going to lead to a better world in ABC ways. How's that?
That's great. I have another question for you. This person's asking, can you please throw some light on the fact how advocacy efforts can be sustained in case of a changing political environment, which is constantly happening in many places? So how can we continually engage if it's building a relationship with people that might be through a revolving door? How do our advocacy efforts how do we sustain those efforts?
Okay, that's a great question, and I'm going to first apply it here, and then I'll do my best to apply it in the context that I think many of you are finding yourselves. The first thing is there is a revolving door, but it always seems to revolve back, and so people so you have to take the long view, and so people who we dealt with in the Bush administration are now in areas of responsibility in the Trump administration. People who, Democrats who worked for Congress people are now on key committees. And so the relationship, the nurturing those relationships is something that has to continue over time, and the door always seems to revolve back in a way. And so I think that's the first thing. And someone once, a former boss once told me that when people lose elections, reach out to them, because that's when they're most going to appreciate because they're always going to come back. And there's something to that. So that's the first thing. Then in contexts where, in many of the countries where we operate, of course, there's kind of a winner takes all reality where government wins and then it makes a complete change. And it's really hard. It's hard to mitigate the risk of that, except for to just get back in there and build new relationships. And so, as just like here, there's a whole cadre of professional staff in both the Congress and the legislature and the executive branch who are not politically appointed. They're always in the Ministry of Health. The further down you go, people who this is their job, and if you have a relationship with them, you still have a relationship with them. It's a real question. It's a real challenge and a real problem. Certainly, right now we are trying to have meetings with every new member of Congress, and there's over 100 of them, and it's exhausting, but that's what has to happen. The relationship building never stops, and that's just that's the nature of the beast.
Yeah, it's the nature of the work with advocacy. So to follow on that, Bill, I have another question that's coming in saying, South Asian developing countries, there's a lot of political commitment lately on the key WHO global targets for reducing anemia, stunting, underweight, etc. So how can we engage state level and district level administration units to commit themselves towards to nutrition interventions and using implementation science to make that argument?
That's a great question. I mean, the good news, lots of good news there, that the national governments there in that part of the world are committing to the reaching WHO targets. That's fantastic. And what I'm kind of reading between the lines is that that commitment might not be bubbling down all the way down to the local, district, regional level where you have government staff and officials who are maybe not, not so much in the loop. And of course, this is a constant problem everywhere, including here. And part of advocacy, I think, involves getting people to talk to each other, presenting consistent information to different audiences. So if you have the science and the results that led to the national government making a decision to support reaching these targets, sometimes it's our job and your job to present that evidence to the district and regional folks so that they can go through their own kind of change process in their thinking. Because, these are huge bureaucracies. Information doesn't always flow down. And so, assuming goodwill, I think sometimes we just have to connect the dots between people within the bureaucracy. In some ideal world, they would connect all those dots, but we are not in the ideal world. So being aware of that and thinking, okay, this policy doesn't seem to be bubbling down here. So, and there's lots of ways you could do that. One is, of course, in one-on-one meetings or taking and sharing research. The other is you could hold a forum and sort of a public forum and bring implementers together with government officials. And again, it all depends on the context whether it's possible. So, but I'm brainstorming here with you. You could. The other thing is you could go to the national, if you have a good relationship at the national level, and simply say, doesn't seem to be bubbling down here. How can we help you to get your message and your strategy better connected locally, and try to kind of be a supporter of that. And we certainly do a lot of that in Washington, actually. But it's a good problem to have if at the national level, at least, the policy is policies there. The other thing is, because you're all implementation scientists, you maybe have a perspective based on your research about why the policy isn't bubbling down, and just shedding light on that process might be helpful.
Yeah, those are great suggestions, Bill. I think for all of us who do work in that space, we realize, that building those relationships, having those one-on-one meetings, and bringing together the policymakers with the implementers are excellent suggestions to help advance that agenda at the local or more county or state level administration units. I'm conscious of the time, so we have 4 minutes left, and so I think we're going to be wrapping up because I don't see any other questions on the question box. I don't know, Bill, if there's anything else that you want to say to close off, and if not, then I will close the webinar for us.
So I just first thank you, everybody. I mean, we're all on the same team here, and I think I hope you feel that your work, I hope this has been helpful in thinking through how, in the context that you find yourselves, you can contribute to the kinds of local, national, and global policy changes that your organization is seeking to be a part of. I hope the examples that I gave are transferable, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be on the same team as you all as we seek to help people to live full and vital lives rooted in nutritional security and good health. So thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you very much to you, Bill. I know you're quite busy, so we really do appreciate valuable insights and some great tips that you gave us that I know I will certainly be using in my work. And we hope that this webinar has been informative and thought-provoking to our listeners. If you have any questions or ideas for upcoming webinars, please contact SISN at comms@implementnutrition.org. And you can also visit our website and stay up to date with our activities and learn more about implementation science and nutrition and the various engagement opportunities that are available to our members. We're active on social media, so we welcome your thoughts, comments, and engagement through Twitter and LinkedIn, as always. And when you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a very brief survey, and we would appreciate if you could take a moment to provide feedback on this webinar. You'll also receive a follow-up email in a few weeks with a link to the webinar recording, as well as a PDF of the slides. And look out for details for our next webinar in our 2019 series. So on behalf of SISN, thank you, Bill, for joining us today. And thanks to our listeners, and we wish everyone a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.